Shadow beneath the frame. Mark had long outgrown fairy tales. He was 28, worked as an architect, and valued rationality above all else. Yet after moving into his grandfather's old apartment, he felt that long-forgotten tickle in his spine again. His bed was heavy, made of oak, with very little space between the frame and the floor, the kind where the darkness beneath seems thicker than the air itself. During the first week, he blamed everything on adjustment, but on the 8th night, he heard it. A quiet, wet, smacking sound, as if someone were slowly chewing something soft right under his mattress. Mark froze. His hand was hanging off the edge of the bed. He jerked it back sharply, and at that exact second, something made a faint click against the wooden leg of the bed. "Just rats," he whispered into the emptiness. But rats don't breathe that heavily. From beneath the bed came a sound like a blacksmith's bellows at work, except instead of air, something viscous seemed to roll and shift inside it. Mark gathered his courage. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, took a deep breath, leaned over the edge, and suddenly aimed the beam under the bed. Empty. Only a thin layer of dust and an old tennis ball he had lost just yesterday. Mark exhaled. Rationality had won. He turned off the flashlight and lay down again. 5 minutes later, he felt the mattress bend beneath him. Not from above, where he was lying, but from below, as if something large and flat had pressed its back against the slats of the bed, trying to lift Mark upward. He wanted to scream, but paralysis gripped his throat. The smacking sound returned, now right next to his ear, even though he was alone in the room. Then, from beneath the edge of the bed, fingers began to appear slowly, millimeter by millimeter. They were far too long. The skin on them looked like wet parchment, through which sharp, crooked joints showed. The fingers did not grab him. They gently felt along the edge of the blanket, as if searching for a gap to slip inside. Mark dared one final move. He leapt out of bed, knocking over the lamp, and rushed toward the light switch on the wall. Click. Light flooded the room. The bedroom was empty. The bed stood in its place. The windows were closed. He breathed heavily, pressing his back against the door. His eyes fell on the dust near the bed's legs. There were no footprints. But when he looked at the mattress, his heart stopped. From beneath the white sheet, a thick black liquid was slowly seeping through. It wasn't flowing from somewhere. It was bleeding through the fabric right in the center, exactly where his back had just been. And then Mark heard a voice. It wasn't coming from under the bed. It was coming from inside the mattress. "Thank you for letting me in. It's so cozy in here." The mattress shuddered, as if something enormous had turned inside it, and Mark saw the fabric stretch as the clear shape of a human face pushed upward from beneath, trying to break through to the outside. Guests of Peripheral Vision. Artem had always known that his bedroom had dead zones. These were the corners where the street lamp's light couldn't reach, leaving thick patches of anthracite darkness. He never paid much attention to them before, but after a long stretch of insomnia, the boundary between reality and exhaustion began to blur. It all started with the armchair, an ordinary old chair where he carelessly threw his jacket. At 2 a.m, in the half-dark, the jacket turned into the shape of a hunched old man sitting with his head lowered. Artem blinked, and the silhouette vanished, becoming just a pile of clothes again. But the next night, the chair was empty, and the silhouette remained. It stood slightly to the left of the chair, a thin, black vertical shape that had no volume, yet was darker than the darkness itself. Artem couldn't look at it directly. The moment he focused his gaze, the figure dissolved into the air. It existed only at the edge of his peripheral vision. "It's just hallucinations from exhaustion," he reassured himself, pulling the blanket up to his chin. But the silhouette didn't just stand there. Each following night, it took a step closer to the bed. On the fourth night, there were two of them. The second silhouette was shorter and wider. It didn't stand, it seemed to hang just beneath the ceiling, in the corner above the wardrobe. Artem could feel their gazes on him, even though the figures had no eyes. It was a heavy, physical pressure that made his limbs go numb. He tried sleeping with a nightlight on, but it only made things worse. The shadows from the furniture grew longer and sharper. They began to live their own lives. When Artem raised his hand, the shadow on the wall did the same, but with the faintest delay. For a fraction of a second it remained still, as if deciding whether it should obey its owner. On the night that would become the last of his peace, Artem woke with a feeling of cold. The room was absolutely silent. Even the clock had stopped ticking. Carefully, he shifted his eyes to the side. The tall silhouette stood right next to the bed. Its arms, long black streaks, were reaching toward Artem's face. He held his breath, afraid to move. And then he noticed the most terrifying thing. The second silhouette, the one near the wardrobe, was now slowly sliding down the wall toward the floor. It moved in jerks like damaged footage in an old film. When the shadow touched the floor, Artem heard a quiet sound, the sound of tearing paper. He realized then, these weren't shadows being cast onto the walls. The walls were casting shadows into his world. The figure beside the bed leaned closer. Artem smelled ozone and old dust. The black emptiness where its face should have been moved near his ear, and from it came a sound like thousands of insects beating against glass. "We're tired of being flat." Artem squeezed his eyes shut and began counting to 10. When he opened them again, dawn had already filled the room. But something was wrong. Light from the window fell across the floor, illuminating the bed, the nightstand, the wardrobe. Artem looked at his own hand, which he had raised in front of him. There was no shadow on the floor. He slowly turned toward the wall. There, inside the deep black stain of the corner, stood a silhouette that was an exact copy of Artem. Only this silhouette was slowly, triumphantly smiling, having finally found its volume. The last lights of the farmstead. The Haromov family moved to the edge of an old forest, searching for peace. The father, Victor, said the air here was healing, and the mother, Olena, was delighted with the large garden. But their little daughter, Sofika, from the very first night, began drawing strange pictures. Tall black trees whose branches were long fingers. The dog disappeared first. Baron, the old shepherd, simply vanished in the middle of the day. No barking, no drops of blood, only a torn leather collar hanging from a pine branch beyond the edge of the property. Victor blamed wolves, but the forest remained silent. No bird song, no rustling leaves, only a heavy, cotton-like silence. A week later, it was Victor's turn. He went to the shed for firewood as dusk began swallowing the yard. Olena saw him through the kitchen window. He stopped by the woodpile, as if listening to something. Then he stepped into the darkness behind the shed and never returned. Olena called for him all night, searched every bush with a flashlight, but found only his axe. It was embedded in a dry stump so deeply that it looked as if Victor had tried to defend himself from something attacking from above. Left alone, Olena and Sofika barricaded the door. They boarded the windows, leaving only narrow cracks. But the forest had already entered their minds. "Mom, it doesn't want to eat us quickly," Sofika whispered on the third night, pressing against her mother. "It wants us to soak with fear. It tastes better that way." That night, Olena heard Victor's voice. It came directly from behind the door. "Olena, open up. I found Baron." "We got lost, but now we're home." The voice was perfect, down to the last intonation. But Alina could see through the crack between the boards. No one stood on the porch. Only a long, knotted shadow stretching from around the corners of the house, and a strange sound, the scraping of wood against wood, like dry branches rubbing together. The next morning, Sofika was gone from her bed. The doors were locked with every latch. The windows remained boarded shut. But in the center of the room, on the carpet, lay a pile of dry pine needles and cones arranged in the shape of a child's figure. Olina ran into the forest, screaming her daughter's name until her lungs burned from the freezing air. She ran deep into the thicket, where the trees stood so tightly that sunlight could not break through the canopy. There she saw them: Victor, Sofika, and even Baron. They stood in a circle around an old, twisted oak. But they were not them. Their eyes were filled with black resin, and their skin looked like gray bark. They did not move. They did not breathe. They had become part of the forest. From behind the trunk of the oak, it emerged. A gigantic creature standing on 7 thin legs like poles. Its head was the skull of a moose, but instead of eyes, there pulsed rotten lights. The creature made a sound. It was Sofika's crying, so real that Olina instinctively reached her hands forward.
"Mom, come to us. It doesn't hurt here,"
the monster creaked in her daughter's voice. Olina turned and ran. Behind her, she did not hear footsteps, but the rustling of thousands of leaves and the snapping of dry branches chasing her. She managed to jump into the house and lock herself inside. Now she sits in the center of the living room. The candle is burning low. The scraping on the roof is growing louder. She knows. The forest does not release what it considers its own. She can feel her own fingers beginning to harden, becoming like branches. And in her throat, instead of a scream, the rustling of wind is beginning to form. She is the last one. And the forest is already opening its jaws to swallow the last light of the farmstead. Thank you for listening to these stories until the end. If you enjoyed this video and want to hear more creepy and mysterious stories, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you have your own scary story, feel free to share it in the comments. See you in the next story.